Welcome to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. I'm your host, Brian Griffith, and here's what's going down this week in your backyard and across the world. This week, we are continuing to cover the unfolding saga of the Austin officials' mishandling of sexual assault cases that has become sort of a nationwide issue, has made national news at this point several times over. A lawsuit has been filed and is kind of in motion at the moment against several Austin officials regarding these handling of sexual assault cases. So to talk so much more about this, we are joined by one of the plaintiffs in the lawsuit, Julie Ann Nitsch. Thank you, Julie, for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
And we are also joined by Elizabeth Myers, who is a partner at Thompson Knight, and she is representing Julie as well as the other plaintiffs in the lawsuit. Thank you, Elizabeth, for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
So I'd like to get into what the lawsuit is really all about in the first place. For those people who might not be familiar with what's been going on regarding Austin police handling of sexual assault cases, this has been a very ongoing issue for quite some time. There have been kind of many different phases. So I'm wondering if you can kind of briefly provide a summary of kind of what has led us up to this point and what the lawsuit hopes to address.
Sure. So as you correctly pointed out, there's a long history in Austin and in Travis County of mishandling of sexual assault cases, particularly cases that involve female victims. And so last summer, we filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of adult female survivors of sexual assault who were assaulted in Travis County and reported their assaults. So these women bravely did what everyone tells them to do, which is if you are assaulted, report it. And yet they're not seeing any justice done. Their cases aren't being prosecuted. They're not being investigated appropriately. Frankly, they're being re-traumatized in the process of reporting and trying to pursue justice. And so we brought a lawsuit on behalf of those women. We began with 3 named plaintiffs. Julie was one of our original plaintiffs. Shortly after filing the lawsuit in June, we started receiving calls from more women. I think at this point we're close to 100 who have reached out to us to let us know that similar things have happened. We've since amended the complaint. We now have 8 named plaintiffs, still on behalf of thousands of women. And we also have other clients who are not yet named in the lawsuit.
So this lawsuit names quite a few people in regard to who is supposed to have mishandled the sexual assault cases, including, I believe, Austin Police Chief Brian Manley, former Austin Police Chief Art Acevedo, the former Travis County District Attorney Rosemary Lemberg, as well as Travis County Sheriff Sally Hernandez. I'm wondering if you can go through the problems here. Like, essentially, what are the sort of the systemic failings that have kind of continued to happen?
Well, so they run the gamut, but I want to offer a quick correction. Travis County Sheriff Sally Hernandez was actually dropped out of the lawsuit, and so the current version of the complaint is against the city. That oversees APD, the current and former police chiefs, Travis County, because they're the entity that oversees the DA's office, and then the current and former DAs. And at a very high level, what the lawsuit lays out and articulates is that for decades, law enforcement and prosecutors in Travis County have been refusing to move forward with sexual assault cases when the victims are women. And that manifests itself in all different kinds of ways, from the way victims are treated when they first report to the backlog of the sexual assault kits where evidence is literally just sitting on shelves for decades at a time, to not prioritizing investigations of criminal assailants who target women, to just refusing flat out to prosecute no matter what the evidence shows. So all of those things are symptoms of the larger systemic problem. And the lawsuit, at its core, alleges that these defendants are violating the U.S. and Texas constitutions by not providing equal protection to women.
Yeah, I think it's very telling. And if you look at the numbers, it definitely bears out what I believe to be clearly a gross miscarriage of justice or a real grave injustice regarding the way these different kind of city entities have attempted to deal with sexual assault. Looking at the data between June 2016 and June 2017, in a year, Austin police received more than 1,000 sexual assault reports. Only a handful have been prosecuted, and only one had gone to trial in that time. And one of the disgusting things to me that we've seen most lately, and maybe to back it up even before that, even before our kind of current point, we can look at sort of the history of APD as having not processed any of the evidence they had received, to the point where I understand that there was essentially like mold at one point growing on many of these rape kits. So like this evidence gathered was completely useless. After that became sort of a public issue, then is when APD started stepping up the quote unquote clearance rate, trying to clear so many of these these backlogged rape and sexual assault cases. And then that's actually what made the national news, because the way they were handling that, many have accused them of essentially fudging the numbers, where they were using the mechanism of exceptional clearance to clear, I believe, a majority of their cases. But the actual exceptional clearance by and large leads to no prosecution. It's when, according to APD, they said they had an exceptional clearance is when they have a suspect, but something is preventing them from moving forward with that. And, Austin Police Chief Brian Manley has many times essentially said, resorted to essentially kind of a victim blaming tactic of saying that the reason that these cases are not getting are not going to prosecution is because the victims themselves or the survivors themselves do not want to prosecute. But I think looking at this lawsuit and looking at the reaction of groups like the Survivor Justice Project, it bears out that people who go forward do want some sort of justice, and they're not getting it. So I'm wondering, Julie, if you can kind of talk about your own experience with this.
They don't want some sort of justice. They want justice.
Yes.
I've been working with Survivor Justice Project. And again, that's another movement started by women to help women get through this process. But what we really want to see is systematic change. And that's what I really want people to understand, is that, they talk about, well, we've cleared the backlog. Well, those still are not put in CODIS, which of course is the federal system where violent offenders DNA is held. And that's the issue. If the police, and it's a cultural issue, if the police seemingly have this, and I can't say it's for sure, but it seems to me and other survivors that there is this culture of, well, it was consensual and she changed her mind, that's her fault. Or, oh, well, she just did it and is embarrassed now, so now she's trying to make an excuse. And that's a culture that is pervasive in our criminal justice system when it comes to sexual assault. And that's what we've seen time and time and time again, is these detectives telling women, well, we can't prove that it wasn't consensual. And before I was a part of this lawsuit, just because of my, work with Planned Parenthood and other women's organizations, I've had women reaching out to me for years when this happens. And as I testified in front of City Council several years ago, I got to a point where I just told them not to report, because it was so traumatic to have them, belittled and bullied by these supposed detectives that are supposed to be on their side. So that's the issue, is that from the time it happens, the woman is told, we don't really believe you. Can you prove it? I just met someone this weekend who was assaulted in December, mere months ago, who was told, ask your neighbors if they heard you screaming. Do you think a survivor wants to go and ask her neighbors, hey, did you hear me getting raped last night? And that's the same thing they told me. Wow. Ask your neighbors if they saw anything. This is the way we are treated. So from that very instance, they take your body and they violate you essentially all over again. Photograph, collect evidence over your whole body. If I'm willing to go through all of that, I want justice. And then it's just dropped. There's nothing else. And then you have people like SAFE, Survivor Justice Project. You know, whenever we testified and got the EMDR treatment, the woman I just talked to is now at least getting therapy for what she went through. But it's just women trying to help women get through this. At what point do we stand up and say our tax dollars, our rights, they're a part of this system. You're supposed to be prosecuting, investigating, keeping people safe. That's what you're paid for. At what point do we stand up and say, do your damn job and stop treating us this way? Because that's what I mean. Until you're convicted of a violent offense, your DNA doesn't go in the system. So 1 million women can continue to do these DNA kits and these rape kits. But until you catch him the first time, he just keeps getting away with it. So you're just creating this safe space for rapists to just go, oh, they'll never prove it wasn't consensual. I'll never get convicted. My DNA will never go in there. I can just continue to do this. And that is a gross miscarriage of justice.
KUT released a story recently titled "Sexual Assault Survivor Accuses Travis County Prosecutor of Lying About Her Case," that I think is a very important story for people to look at who are curious about this. And you can see, just going to read a little bit from it. In a court filing in Nueces County on Monday, lawyers asked for depositions from the 3 prosecutors for Burchart's file. Essentially, Mindy Montford, I'm losing her title here.
She's the first assistant district attorney.
Okay.
She's the second in command to Margaret Moore.
So essentially, during the call, Dawn McCracken, the former sister-in-law and family friend of the Burcharts, one of the survivors here, asked Montford to explain why Burchart's case was not prosecuted. Montford then spent more than half an hour sharing explicit details of the case without Burchart's permission. Montford also made claims that don't match the statements Burchart filed with police. This is a quote from Mindy Montford, said, "I'm not allowed to talk about this case right now, but I wanted you to have it because you've got to have some perspective. If Burchart, if she was lying, saying it wasn't consensual, that's one thing, but she says it was consensual. And from my understanding, Burchart is saying that is not correct, that is not what she told.
Absolutely untrue, and she has never maintained that any part of it was consensual."
Yeah, maybe we can just kind of talk about the ramifications of this, what that would mean if indeed Mindy Montford was kind of providing these details to families of a victim of sexual assault or rape.
Well, I mean, I can tell you from my perspective that there are 2 issues going on. First is that the first assistant district attorney seemed to think it was okay to call and discuss specific details of the rapes of a particular victim with someone who was not the victim and without permission from the victim, which I find abhorrent. Victim confidentiality is something that is paramount, and I can't believe that anyone would think it was okay to call and talk about a victim without that victim's permission. Separate and apart from that, and worse in this case, is that she decided to call this third party and then lie about what this victim allegedly said. And it's not hard to determine what the victim said. There was a lawsuit pending where Ms. Burchart bravely told her story. There's a police file where she gave a 2.5-hour formal statement to the police. And there's a police file where she maintains throughout that none of this was consensual. So the idea that Ms. Montford would call someone and misrepresent Ms. Burchart's own words and say that the reason they declined to prosecute is because the victim said it was consensual is just a lie.
It's really disgusting, and as we've been talking about, it's a such a kind of systemic problem that runs through kind of all of the criminal justice systems here that seems to just continually pop up in one form or another as we've talked about repeatedly. I'm wondering kind of what else as we talked about this a little bit, as we've kind of talked about the lawsuit. I'm wondering if we can get into what the lawsuit hopes to kind of accomplish. What sort of the end goal is here in trying to bring justice for all these survivors and in trying to really change the system here.
Yeah, I mean, the goal is systemic change. And I also want to do one follow-up to what we were just talking about is after being informed about what happened, and this is reported by KUT as well, the district attorney apparently read the transcript and decided everything was just fine.
Wow.
Which I also find almost unbelievable. It's hard to wrap your head around someone saying that was okay.
Yeah.
So I do think it runs all the way to the top. And I think Julie's right. It's a cultural issue. It's a systemic issue. It requires change across the system. And I also think Julie is right that there are many, many, many places where women and survivors are helping each other find therapy and counseling and support and healing. But the place where it's continuing to break down is in the justice system. Mm-hmm. We have wonderful organizations that support victims. We have amazing counselors who work their entire careers. We have a SART that is second to none, that's been around for 30 years. We don't need any more resources of support for victims. What we need is for APD to do its job and investigate cases correctly. And we need the DA to do her job and prosecute cases. And their only jobs are to do that. But none of them seem to want to talk about that and how badly they're doing it.
And I don't think that it's asking too much to ask them to do their job. They get paid to do this. The women that go through and work on these resolutions and testify and work on the grants to get other women counseling and reach out to women and get them in this support, we aren't getting paid for that. We're not asking to get paid. We're just doing it so someone doesn't have to suffer like we did. Can't they just do their damn jobs? If I was a car, they would have spent more time investigating a crime against me. Literally.
I think it's very telling how to me, the conversation has sort of shifted a little bit in terms of, for a while, a lot of police departments were using this as sort of an excuse or a justification to ask for more resources. Mm-hmm. It's always, we just don't have the resources to prosecute this. But what I think we've seen is a shift where organizations, and, this could be just my understanding, but I've understood that, like, sort of the Survivor Justice Project, that was originally one of the more one of the goals is to get more resources at toward essentially like bringing justice for these cases.
Well, initially it was a grant.
Okay.
To do the EMDR, which is for post-traumatic stress disorder.
Okay.
Which is often associated with combat. But it's actually very, very common with survivors of sexual assault and sexual trauma. So we work to get that out of the police budget, and I think that there's something that needs to be said here. As a white woman, I'm a lot more likely to receive some amount of justice. I didn't, but I think it needs to be said that Austin Police Department shows a lot more disparaging when it comes to people of color. So let it be known that, I do have that privilege, and I know that what I went through and what other survivors have gone through that are white is probably nothing compared to what women of color go through in this city. But what Survivor Justice Project was working on was getting, again, resources for women who have survived. It wasn't, that was our goal. I remember we didn't have a name. It was just like, we need to get this. And it was the grant for the EMDR. But then we kind of started, what is our next step? What is our next step? And that's kind of how, this continues to move forward over the last several years. But again, the idea is we really we shouldn't be having to do this. At what point do our elected officials stand up and say, hey, look, I read it. This is happening. It's not like, we're just claiming this happened. It's fact. It's part of the public record that all of these things happened. You can also look at, lots of other statistics, like most women don't report. So of those reporting, no one's getting justice really, or very few rather. So we're just asking them to do their jobs so that we can, help survivors move forward. But yeah, I mean, APD has some real serious issues, and I definitely feel like as a survivor that we have been used kind of as a token to say, hey, look, but we have these cases when they didn't actually find any justice. They just exceptionally cleared them, as opposed, and then get a bigger police budget.
Yeah, the kind of exceptional clearance thing, we've definitely covered that, and I definitely believe people need to kind of look at that as sort of a way that APD sort of avoids trying to deal with any of these systemic things, and it goes to show that like it's not about the lack of resources that police have. I mean, the police budget continues to essentially surge. Police in many ways have all the money they could reasonably need and more to deal with this sort of things. It's about, first of all, allocation. It's about proper management. It's about making sure that if there are people who are mishandling this sort of stuff intentionally or unintentionally, that they are held accountable. And I think to some degree it's also about having to a very large degree, it's about having independent oversight, of the police department, of police and the way they function. I'm wondering, here in Austin, we just passed essentially the Office of Police Oversight. We established an Office of Police Oversight that kind of operates a little bit more effectively, or is at least geared to operate more effectively than the previous kind of Office of the Police Monitor. I'm wondering how much that kind of intersects with your work at the Survivor Justice Project. If you've seen any, if it's still too soon in the game to have seen how, or not the game, but if it's still too soon in the struggle to see kind of results from that, or to have kind of the data that you could use to move forward, or maybe, what sort of impact has that had?
Well, as I said, I just met with a survivor that was raped on the 13th or 16th, I think she said, of December. So merely not even 3 months ago. And she experienced the very same mistreatment and, case suspended, whatever. We can't prove it's not consensual. Ask your neighbors if they heard you scream. That was just a couple months ago. And like you said, there are best practices, and this is a nationwide problem. But I think in Austin, it's so believable, as Elizabeth was saying, like that an ADA would do this, that the district attorney would stand up for this, and with Matt Lee's faux apology, which was like a slap in the face, literally, that's like hitting someone going, I'm sorry if it hurt. He said, if you were hurt, I'm sorry that you were hurt. So I think that Austinites consider themselves to be very progressive and very liberal. So they really don't want to hear this issue. They don't want to hear what's happening in their city, because I've been screaming this to the rooftops for years, and nobody wants to listen because they refuse to believe it can be that bad. But whenever, you sit down with the articles, you watch the documentaries, you listen to the testimony, you realize, my God, they're doing nothing to prosecute or bring justice, not only for the survivors, but like I said, until you get convicted, you don't go into that system. So if you never can get convicted the first time, you just continue to do what you're going to do. 80% of rapists are repeat offenders, statistic. So how many rapists do we have running around in Austin that are committing these crimes as many times as they want and getting away with it?
When you talk about slap in the face, the fact that this essentially made national news, the fact that essentially investigators with ProPublica, Newsy, and other kind of national news outlets did a major investigative, a piece of investigative journalism into this, found essentially that the APD was likely misclassifying well over 1,000 rape cases as having been quote unquote exceptionally cleared, which led to, again, no arrest. An exceptional clearance does not lead to an arrest. It does not lead to any sort of prosecution. And so all of these rape cases after APD, just to sort of summarize here, after APD, Austin Police Department had essentially been called out for allowing all of these rape kits to sit and collect mold and essentially, be worthless after they were not, investigating these rape cases at all for so long. Then, from my understanding, they began, essentially exceptionally clearing these in order to puff up their numbers of rape cases they had quote unquote solved. But none of these were leading to arrest. None of these were leading to prosecution. So essentially, they just sort of passed the buck on down the road.
Right. But you also need to know that even when they quote unquote clear that backlog, nothing happens with that.
Yeah.
So it doesn't go into CODIS. And of those that they clear, they check to see if there's DNA on them. So yeah, somebody's DNA is on that, but you don't know who it is. So they're still only doing a portion of what needs to be done to try to convict someone or find the perpetrator. It's
just mind-boggling that they would have this happen, and then that after it became national news, that they would just continue doing it. I mean, I guess it's not as mind-boggling as I wish it was for anyone who's kind of followed Austin Police Department, not just with this sort of thing, but also in sort of the systemic racism issues they faced and classism and whatnot. But it's always disappointing. So we have a couple minutes left. I'm wondering if there's anything we haven't really hit on that you'd kind of like to bring up, like to kind of bring people's attention to, or otherwise, if there are kind of places you would recommend that people could find more information.
I would like to acknowledge that I know that this is a very difficult subject to hear about, and I know it's especially hard for people that consider themselves to be progressive. But I will say it is almost as if the people in charge, particularly at our police department, from the bottom up, do not believe that sexual assault is a thing. They refuse to, seemingly to me, refuse to accept that any woman that goes through the trauma and pain of having her door kicked down and taking a rape kit must have just changed her mind and now is just trying to, cry wolf. And so I think we really need to look at that as a culture. But we need people to watch the Newsy documentary. We need you to read up on this because you will not believe what APD is getting away with. And when you get angry enough, share it with a comment, call someone who represents you, and do something about it. And I would like to thank the legislators that have put forth bills. Nyave, I know that Gina Hinojosa is sponsoring some stuff, and I know that Kirk Watson is as well. And so I appreciate that, but it really starts at the local level. So we really need y'all to learn about this as hard as it is and to take action on it.
Just a couple of last thoughts. First, to all the survivors, I want them to know they're not alone, and that there are women who have gone through the same experience with APD and DA, and that there is nothing particular about their case, and it is not their fault that things are not moving forward. I don't think it's possible to understand until you start looking at it as a system, that it literally is the system and it's not any individual survivor. But to a person, every woman I've spoken to thought that there was something wrong with them or their case, and that's why it didn't go forward. And so I want survivors to know that that's not true. Our case is about women who have bravely come forward and did the thing that everyone tells women they should do when they're the victim of a crime. They reported it. The vast majority of them also got rape kits done. The idea that women who have been violated physically and emotionally and have found the courage to report that and then follow through with an investigation process that often includes many, many hours of a rape kit then suddenly don't want to prosecute their rapists is insane. I don't have a better word for that. If those cases aren't being prosecuted, it's not because the women don't want them prosecuted. It is something else. And that something else is a system that doesn't prioritize women and crimes against them. And it's wrong and it's immoral and it's horrifying that it's happening in Austin, Texas. As an Austinite, I'll tell you, I can't believe it. It's also unconstitutional and it's illegal. And they need to stop doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to go ahead and wrap it up there. We have been joined by Julie Ann Nitsch, who's one of the plaintiffs involved in a lawsuit against several Austin officials. We have also been joined by Elizabeth Myers, a partner at Thompson Knight, representing Julie and other plaintiffs on this lawsuit. Thank you both very much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
You have been listening to People's Republic. People's Republic originates on KOP 91.7 FM Austin and is also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 FM New Orleans. We are also available as a podcast on SoundCloud, Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. Stay tuned. Welcome back to People's Republic. For our second segment this week, we are going to hear from the press release put on essentially by the Answer Coalition. As some of you might know, I am actually traveling for kind of reporting this week with the Answer Coalition, that's Act Now to Stop War and End Racism Coalition, that's putting on a nationwide protest in Washington, D.C. to protest essentially Trump's illegal sanctions and war against the Venezuelan people. So I have been, going to D.C., and so, part of that is being able to kind of record on the spot and be able to, be present for this sort of thing, to report back both, on my show through, what I'm able to record, on the spot, as well as to be able to, make the connections and bring in more expert voices to the show to continue to comment about Venezuela. So that's all going to be going on. We're going to kick this off with Esteban Hernandez, who's an organizer with the Answer Coalition, who will be introducing the speakers you're going to be hearing for the next half an hour. I hope this is informative, and I hope that, this kind of embedded journalism kind of brings some depth to the show. After all, we do indeed report from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. So stay tuned.
Let me just say so what's your radio show?
People's Republic.
People's Republic, Austin, Texas. Claudia, Atlanta. We taking social media photos. Everybody knows Brian, Florida. We know. Hey, Blue. This is Inan. He's an independent filmmaker. He's going to be making a film for the march and everything. Yeah, brother. Em is on Answer Coalition Facebook Live.
Oh, yes. Oh, God. Okay. Smiles, we're filming the revolution. Not televised.
But over the first Welcome, everybody. My name is Esteban Hernandez, and I'm an Answer Coalition organizer based here in Atlanta, Georgia. We're gathering here on Friday, the 15th of March, getting ready to head up to Washington, D.C. for the National March on Washington, U.S. Hands Off Venezuela! We're broadcasting live on Facebook because we want the world to know what we're here to do today. We have a tremendous task ahead of us. The U.S. anti-war movement is now mobilizing in defense of Venezuela. Our demands are U.S. hands off Venezuela. No to the coup. It was on January 23rd that Juan Guaido, who was virtually unknown to the Venezuelan population, declared himself the so-called president. He only did so after receiving a phone call from Vice President of the United States, Mike Pence, encouraging him to do so. He has no right whatsoever under Venezuelan law or the Constitution of the Bolivarian movement and the people of Venezuela to be president. This is a coup orchestrated by the United States that we've seen before. Our demands are no to the sanctions. U.S. government, the Pentagon, the State Department has been imposing sanctions, devastating sanctions, which have ripped the economy apart in Venezuela. It's making it very difficult to have a normal life. Sanctions are designed to attack the population, and it's designed to destabilize that government. We are here to demand no war. We are sick and tired of war. Some of us here today have had a war going on since they were born. The American people are against war. We've been doing a lot of outreach in the streets, talking to people about this attack on Venezuela, and people know this is a war. This is a war for empire, not a war for humanitarian means. So we are against that. Secondly, I wanted to say that there's a reason behind everything that we're seeing today. There is a reason that the United States is opposed to the Bolivarian Revolution. There's a reason that the United States, including Donald Trump, Abrams, Mike Pompeo, the whole lot of them. And that reason is because the Bolivarian Revolution and the Venezuelan people have stood up once and for all to say that the Venezuelan resources are for the Venezuelan people, not for the empire. And we cheer them for this, and we salute them for this, and we are behind them for this. And that's their right. Sovereignty for the Venezuelan people, their resources for them, not for empire's plunder. Yes, right. Lastly, I'd like to say before we call up some speakers is that if we mobilize, we can stop the United States' imperialist aggression. If we get out into the streets by the hundreds, by the thousands, by the hundreds of thousands, and yes, eventually, one day in the millions, we can stop this corrupt, decrepit, racist system. We can stop war once and for all through people's power. So we're going to call up some speakers who are coming from across the South. We have different areas represented in different organizations who are going to come up and say why they're coming to Washington, D.C. So first up, please welcome Shelby Shoup from Tallahassee, Florida, representing Students for Justice in Palestine.
Hello. Thank you, Esteban. My name is Shelby, and I'm here representing not only PSL Tallahassee, but Florida State University Students for Justice in Palestine. And we are here today to stand in solidarity with the Venezuelan people. If the United States actually cared about the poor and oppressed people of the world, don't you think that they would have intervened in Gaza by now, where 97% of the water is undrinkable, where the people of Gaza are lucky to have 4 hours of electricity a day, and where they have been under siege, being bombed by the occupying military for weeks on end. Next Friday, Palestinians in Gaza will be meeting at the apartheid border for the 52nd consecutive Friday in a row to demand their right of return. For a full year, Palestinians trapped in the largest open-air prison in the world in Gaza have been protesting for their right of return and have been killed and sniped. And has the United States offered to intervene or give any humanitarian aid? No. In fact, last month, they cut off all aid to Gaza and the West Bank. And we're supposed to think that their humanitarian mission in Venezuela is earnest? We don't buy it. We do not buy it. Especially when there's a historic precedent of solidarity between the Palestinian and Venezuelan people. Understanding that they are both oppressed nations, strangled by the forces of imperialism. On February 23rd, opposition rallies in Venezuela proudly displayed the Israeli flag that represents settler colonialism and apartheid. And on the same day, the massive pro-Chavismo, pro-Bolivarian, pro-Maduro government rallies that have been totally ignored by the mainstream media in the United States had contingents with people from Palestine waving Palestinian flags. And so we, as progressive supporters of the movement for the liberation of Palestine, we have to ask our fellow progressives and socialists, which side are you on? I am an anti-Zionist Jew, and I am proud to stand for both Palestinian and Venezuelan self-determination and sovereignty. FSUSJP is on the side of revolution, progress, socialism, and democracy. Viva Palestina! Viva la Revolución Bolivariana!
Testing. Next, I'd like to invite up Jimmy from the International Action Center. Please welcome Jimmy.
My name is Jimmy Rayner. I'm an organizer from Atlanta for Workers' World Party. I want to make this brief because y'all have a long trip. That being said, I would find it amazing that we have to organize national demonstrations opposing U.S. interventions if we didn't have to do this time after time. The role the United States is playing in Venezuela is very much like the role the United States played leading up to the invasion of Vietnam. Just in my lifetime, there are many places where the U.S. and its allies have meddled in the internal affairs to the point where they have carried out coups. Chile comes to mind right away. This meddling is done for many reasons, but they boil it down to the self-interest of the ruling elite, the 1%. They are threatened when any social movement that is comprised of poor and working people want to take their land and resources back. This is a scenario alarming Washington and its allies, that Venezuela is attempting to use their oil not to benefit the oil monopolies, but to benefit the working class and peasants in Venezuela. It was easier for the Venezuelan popular government to do this when the price of oil was high. But now the lower price of oil has caused problems. It hasn't meant they've given up on this, on social progress. It is the U.S. imposed sanctions and the refusal to trade, along with the stealing of the funds that Venezuela has tied up in U.S. banks and U.S. and British banks, that are hurting the poor and working class of Venezuela. And these actions are illegal acts of war. President Maduro won the last election, which the opposition boycotted, but this opposition has powerful friends led by Trump and Pence, who have placed Bolton and Abrams in charge of the day-to-day intervention in Venezuela. Abrams, a convicted perjurer, has engaged in war crimes. He's the strategic thinker, and Bolton is the blowhard who gets away with saying what most people would be ashamed to think. I want to end this with how the U.S. got 500,000 troops in Vietnam. These are the steps that we engaged in that will lead to war and the unforeseen consequences of war. How many millions of lives, Iraqi and Kurdish, were lost by the U.S. invasion of Iraq? Were the people of the U.S. interests served by that mass slaughter and the billions of dollars wasted for only death and destruction? The loss of millions of Vietnamese and thousands of U.S. GIs. How has that made our land better by this sacrifice? These are just not rhetorical questions. We are paying for these crimes in tax dollars and longing for our loved ones. We need to put the war makers and the war criminals under arrest and aid Venezuela in their attempt to build a new and more equal society. Down with Trump and Pence. War moves in Venezuela. Onward to the answer march in Washington. Build a workers' world.
Next up, I'd like to introduce Sarah Brummett and Peyton, her daughter, coming from Pensacola, Florida, the panhandle of Florida. Sarah is a writer with liberationnews.org.
Hello, good evening, everyone. I do not have a lot of beautifully prepared remarks, but I do want to make a statement about international working class solidarity. I'm from the Gulf Coast, which has been ravaged by many hurricanes in my lifetime, and they are increasing in frequency and in intensity. So I am no stranger to what destruction looks like. And when Hurricane Katrina came and devastated the Gulf Coast and specifically New Orleans area when I was a teenager, a little known fact is that Venezuela the people of Venezuela offered their solidarity to the people of the United States and offered to help fund relief efforts and send relief to the people of New Orleans. And that was under the George W. Bush administration. Then, years later, under the Obama administration, when the federal government cut funding to LIHEAP, which is the low-income heating and energy assistance plan, I think the people of Venezuela once again offered funding and relief for the people who were suffering from cold because they couldn't afford to keep their heat on. So those were acts of international working class solidarity, and it is our responsibility as working class citizens in the imperialist core to show that same solidarity back to the people of Venezuela when we say, U.S. hands off Venezuela, stop the plunder of Venezuelan and Latin American resources, let the Venezuelan people have their sovereignty, and I guess I already said it. U.S. hands off Venezuela.
Thank you, Sarah. Next, I'd like to invite up Jeff from Metro Atlanta DSA.
Hi guys, I'm glad to be here in solidarity with my fellow comrades. Imperialism is just simply incompatible with socialism. And if we're going to fight the growing imperialism and fascism that is creeping around the world, we must stand as a united front broadly across the left, not just within the United States, but internationally as well, as we've recently seen with the events in New Zealand. So, as I said, I'm just here to stand in solidarity with my other comrades and oppose this intervention in Venezuela. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeb. Next, I would like to invite up Hakeem, who is a member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation, based in Birmingham, Alabama.
I'm Hakeem, last name's irrelevant, and I've prepared a little something on the car ride here. Okay, I prepared a little something on the car ride here from Birmingham, and I'm going to say it is important to me as a black person in Imperial Court to attend this march in support of the Venezuelan people and the revolution and continuation of the black radical tradition of practicing internationalism. As a member of an oppressed nation within the diaspora, it is pivotal that we put our support behind other nations that are under attack by imperial forces that claim to represent us. It must be known to 45 and Congress on both sides of their spectrum that there is an anti-war movement in this country. It is growing, we're allowed, and they do not represent our interests, nor do they intend to. You cannot install democracy upon another nation, especially when it is not practiced in your own country. The attack on Venezuelans, a people who chose their leader in the most free and open election to date, is an attack on democracy. The people of Venezuela made their decision, and it is up to us in this nation that is leading the attack on them to make it clear that we support them. It is also up to us to make sure 45 and the crooks that are attacking a nation to attain capital to see that we know what they're up to, that we actively and fully oppose their efforts, and that they will one day get what's coming to them as all empires do. And in honor of Jamil Al-Amin, in his speech to SNCC, if black people see themselves as a colony in the eye of the monster, we've got his brain. If we take out his brain, then we free the people around the world. Yeah.
Thank you, Hakeem. Next, I would like to invite up Bobby, an activist for immigrant rights based in Houston, Texas.
Everybody. Hola, me llamo Bobby. Soy un activista y inmigrante de Houston, Texas, y estoy aquí militando con el Partido por el Socialismo y la Liberación, aquí con mis compañeros también tejanos, también de Houston, Texas, y algunos de Austin y de por demás. La historia de la lucha por los derechos humanos de inmigrantes no es una que empieza primeramente con el hecho de inmigrar, sino es una historia del imperialismo estadounidense. Vemos hoy en día un enfoque sobre el asunto del muro racista de Donald Trump, pero por supuesto es un problema que merece atención, pero para poder lograr cambio sustancial nos conviene investigar a las raíces de la migración hacia los Estados Unidos. Planteamos que el raíz de esta migración es el desplazamiento de nuestros pueblos por falta del sistema capitalista imperialista que nos amenaza con golpes de Estado y sanciones criminales si pretendemos construir nuestras economías y gestionar nuestros asuntos internos de manera independiente y soberana. Y si intentamos evitar el despojo de nuestra América Latina a través de políticas de neoliberalismo y el libre comercio. Nuestro movimiento se orienta en contra de los golpistas en Venezuela, en contra de la injerencia estadounidense y a favor de la revolución bolivariana en su lucha para dirigir su propia destina. Por eso estaremos en Washington, D.C. mañana solidarizándonos con el pueblo venezolano. Hasta la victoria siempre.
Thank you, Bobby. Next, please welcome Anthony Cantu. He is a shop steward with Teamsters 79 and also an activist with the Cuba-Venezuela Solidarity Committee.
Thank you. I just want to talk about the Helms-Burton Act of 1996 that was signed in by Bill Clinton. Until now, Title III of that law had always been suspended by the president. But Trump, 2 weeks ago, he implemented Title III, which is completely unprecedented. It allows U.S. corporations and individuals, even if they weren't Cuban, they're U.S. nationals, they could sue any company or country in the world that invests property in Cuba that was once owned by the United States. Since the U.S. owned most of the land of Cuba, everything is at risk. This is immoral, it's illegal, and we denounce this aggression. Part of the U.S. open proclamation that upset Nicaragua and Venezuela and Cuba, all of this was to end socialism. But we know that this won't work, because we know for a fact that socialism is more popular than ever. We fight to defend Venezuelan sovereignty, or any country for that matter, because the United States has no right to decide which government is and is not legitimate. My family is Cuban, and the Cuban people stand with Venezuela. As someone that also comes from labor, make no mistake what's happening here. Venezuela social gains is a model for the world. The United States has purposely destined this to fail, so it reduces the morale for working people everywhere. That is what the United States wants. We are happy to go to Washington and stand with working people from Venezuela and from Cuba. Hands off Venezuela.
Thank you, Anthony. Now please join me in welcoming from Sarasota, Florida, Ruth Beltran, who is an activist in the movement for Black Lives and an organizer with the Answer Coalition.
The movement for Black Lives stands with the Venezuelan people today in their fight for self-determination and against the U.S. imperialist machine. As we know, Hugo Chavez and the Bolivarian Revolution uplifted the lives of marginalized indigenous and Afro-Venezuelans. The new constitution created under Hugo Chavez advanced the social, cultural, and economic rights of indigenous people, Afro-Venezuelans, and women, including the recognition of intercultural education. The Chavez government used the country's oil wealth to create revolutionary social programs, which resulted in tremendous social gains for the country's poor, excluded sector, many of which are African and indigenous descent. President Maduro wants to continue the legacy. He wants to continue the policies established by Chavez. We know that Venezuela has always stood in solidarity in the fight against the oppression of Black lives here in the United States. In 2015, President Maduro came to Harlem and spoke and met with Black leaders. We know that the Venezuelan government under both Chavez and Maduro has always stood for the against the oppression of Black lives. And that is the reason why today we stand in solidarity with them. We know that because so many social programs were created that uplifted the lives of Afro, Venezuelans, and indigenous people in Venezuela is the main reason why the United States is taking a stand today. This is the reason why the United States wants to stop those policies. It will be naive of us to think that the United States and the Trump administration, as we know, hate the Mexicans, right? Hate Mexicans, Salvadorian, Honduras. But somehow they would like to provide some humanitarian aid to Venezuela specifically and exclusively. We need to question those motives. We need to understand the real reason why the United States is trying to stop the socialist movement in Venezuela. And that is why the movement for Black lives here in the United States stands with the Venezuelan people today. We say, hands off Venezuela.
When I say hands off, you say Venezuela. Hands up! Venezuela! 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 What do we want? U.S. out! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? U.S. out! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? U.S. out! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? U.S. out! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? U.S. out! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? U.S. out! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? U.S. out! When do we want it? Now!
You just heard organizers with the Answer Coalition speaking on just before the bus ride going from Atlanta, Georgia. So we're reporting all across the Deep South, going to the National March in Washington, D.C., which is where I have, essentially joined the Answer Coalition this week for People's Republic. So we're going to continue to cover this, not just the economic and possibly paramilitary developing warfare in Venezuela put on by the United States, but we'll also be reporting, kind of the struggle right here to build a powerful anti-war movement. So I hope you've enjoyed. This is Brian Griffith reporting from Washington, D.C., so stay tuned. That's all we have for this week. You have been listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. People's Republic is produced at KOOP Community Radio in Austin, Texas, and is also syndicated on WHIV 102.3 FM in New Orleans. You can find our show on SoundCloud, iTunes, Spreaker, Spotify, and Stitcher by typing in People's Republic, or you can visit us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX. Thanks for listening as we report on the global struggle for social and economic justice. We are out of here.